We're going to begin our lecture with chapter 1. We're not going to go over the whole chapter, but it's a good place to start to briefly review some things. But we're mainly going to focus on chapter 1, section 2, and section 4. Okay, and this is from the Marie book, obviously. Okay, so to begin, we're going to start by first distinguishing physiology from anatomy, because these two go hand in hand, but they are very distinct. In anatomy, you learn about the different body parts, right, and their relationship to one another. So you also learn how to identify specific body parts. In physiology, you're mainly going to focus on how those body parts work and how they carry out life-sustaining activities. In physiology, there's some subdivisions. So these are based on the organ systems. Okay, so the various organ systems could be like, um, like the respiratory system, the digestive system. Those are all organ systems, and it often focuses on the cellular and molecular levels of the body. So that would be things like, you know, molecules, organelles, things like that. Those are that's at the level of molecules. Or if it's at the cellular level, then it's involving cells. And it looks at how the body's abilities are dependent on those chemical reactions of the individual cells. So to study physiology, you do have to have some understanding of some basic physical principles, like electrical currents, pressure, movement, as well as some chemistry. So on the next chapter, we will review some chemistry. Okay, so like I said, anatomy and physiology, these go hand in hand, okay, because function is always reflected by the structure. So what something can do is reflected by how it's shaped. Okay? And this is known as the principle of complementary of structure and function. So for example, your teeth. So you have different types of teeth that each have a specific function, right, based on their shape. Your front teeth, your incisors, those have more of a sharp edge that make them ideal for chopping. Your canines, those are a lot sharper, so those are more for like puncturing or piercing. And your molars and premolars, those have a flatter surface that make them more ideal for grinding. Okay. So in the human body, it's very organized. If you're going from the smallest chemical level to the whole organism level, you're going to start at the atom. So that'd be the smallest uh, level of organization. So you go from atoms, molecules, and organelles, and then you move on to cells, to tissues. So tissues are a group of similar cells. So for example, like a type of tissue would be muscle, right? Muscle is a type of tissue, and what makes up that muscle are specific types of cells. Okay? So those are the muscle cells. Or if you're talking about nervous tissue, then the cells that make up nervous tissue would be like neurons. Then you have the organ level. So this contains two or more types of tissues. For the most part, most of the organs contain four tissues, but the minimum that they have to have is two tissues. Then there's the organ system level. So this is where organs are working together for a specific function. And eventually you get to the organismal level. So this is where all the organs are combined to make the whole organism, right? So like a person or an animal. So the atoms, the molecules, and the organelles, those are all at the chemical level. The cellular level begins at the cell. So the cell is the smallest structural unit that's able to carry out all the life processes. So things like movement, it could be something like digestion or um, reproduction, growth. So the cell is able to do all of those things. And like I mentioned, those groups of similar cells, those are going to form the tissue. So like here, you can see those smooth muscle tissue that's made up of the smooth muscle cells. Okay, and then those tissues, once you have at least two types of tissues, that's going to form an organ. Okay. So it could be like this, the blood vessel that's shown here. So a blood vessel is a type of organ because it contains at least two tissues. Okay, so it has smooth muscle, has connective tissue, and it also has epithelial tissue. So in this case, you can see three types of tissues. And then beyond the organ level, there's the organ system. So that's where a lot of the organ systems work together. Here you can see the, the vasculatory system. So that includes all of the blood vessels. Uh, those run together with the lymphatic system, which include the lymph nodes and things like that. And then eventually organ systems form an organism. So beyond an organism, it would just be more of you get more into ecology. So it'll go into populations, ecosystems, biospheres, things like that. So humans are multicellular. So to function, the individual cells have to be kept alive. And the organ systems are designed to serve the cells. So all of the cells are dependent on the organ systems to meet the needs that they require to survive. So these organ systems are working together. They're not working in isolation. Okay, so so here you can see several types of organ systems. These are not all of them. There's 11 types of organ systems, which we will get to eventually. These just they show you just several of them. So we have the digestive system, so that's where the food goes in, right? The food is eventually, you know, grinded into a fluid, which is the only way that the body can absorb it, right? So the stomach does a lot of that smashing and churning. The food eventually ends up in the small intestine. That's where the main place where the nutrients are absorbed. So when the nutrients are absorbed, they find their way into the blood vessels, like the arteries, right? So that's part of the cardiovascular system. Okay, from there, it's going to feed the organs and the cells. It's going to feed those nutrients to the organs and the cells, and then exchange. The organs and the cells are going to release their the waste, the metabolic waste, and that metabolic waste is carried in the cardiovascular system, and it finds its way into places like the kidneys. So that's part of the urinary system. So that gets rid of the metabolic waste. So that would be for nutrients. But it also works for oxygen. So the oxygen enters the respiratory system, which includes things like the trachea, the lungs, right? That oxygen is makes its way into the lungs, and then from the lungs, it makes its way into the blood vessels. So small capillaries that are located inside of the lungs, those pick up the oxygen molecules and they carry them or they disperse them throughout the body to the organs and cells. And then when the blood delivers that oxygen, it's going to pick up carbon dioxide in exchange, and then it's going to return that carbon dioxide to the lungs so that it could be expelled. So this is just some way that that shows you how all of these systems they work together. So they're not working in isolation. So just to briefly go over some of these, well, yeah, we're going to go over all of them, but for for this course, you should be familiar with what these systems do. So you have to have a general understanding of what the organ system does. So for example, for the integumentary system, you should know like the main function is to provide protection from the external environment because it's mainly formed by the skin, right? That's the skin, hairs, and nails, but it's mainly the skin, and the main function would be to provide protection. The skeletal system, the main function for that is also to provide protection. So it protects organs. So, for example, the rib cage protects your heart, your lungs, things like that. Your skull protects your brain. Okay, so the main function for the skeletal system is support and protection. Muscles, that should be pretty straightforward. Muscles allow for movement. Okay. And the nervous system, which includes your brain, the spinal cord, and those nerves. Okay, so this is for fast-acting control system of the body, and it responds to internal and external changes. Then there's the endocrine system, which includes glands that secrete hormones that regulate processes, so things like growth, reproduction. You have the cardiovascular system, which includes the blood vessels and the heart. So blood vessels like veins and arteries. Okay, so these obviously we just went over that it transports nutrients, also oxygen, and also uh, carbon dioxide and metabolic waste. We have the lymphatic system. So this is a system that picks up interstitial fluid that leaks out of the blood vessels. So the lymphatic system uh, runs adjacent to the cardiovascular system. Okay, because yeah, that's the main function is to pick up the interstitial fluid that leaks out of the blood vessels, and eventually it returns that fluid back into the cardiovascular system. But it's a place for that allows for an immune response. So the lymph nodes and some of the lymph organs contain white blood cells that help the immune system. Okay, then we have the respiratory system, which includes the nasal cavity, the pharynx, which is, remember, it's kind of like your neck area here. You have the larynx, which is the voice box, the trachea, the windpipe, right, and then the lungs. And here you can see the bronchus. So these are branching off of the trachea are the primary bronchi that lead into the lungs, and then eventually they branch into smaller bronchi. The digestive system. So that's a big. Essentially, it's a big. The alimentary canal. It's a big tube that starts from the mouth, right, which is the opening, goes into the esophagus, to the stomach, small intestine, then the large intestine, and then finally to the rectum and the anus. But then there's also some accessory organs like the liver and the uh, pancreas, the gallbladder. Okay. Then we have the urinary system, so that includes the kidneys, the ureter, the urinary bladder, and the urethra. Okay, the urine is filtered at the kidneys, then it collects, and then it finds its way into the ureter, which transports the urine to the urinary bladder, where it's stored, and then it goes out through the urethra. Then we have the reproductive system, so that includes, testes for the male that produce sperm and the male sex hormone like testosterone. In the female, you have the ovaries, which produce the eggs and also produce the female sex hormones like estrogen. Okay. For the female, you also have the mammary glands, which produce milk. Okay, so now we're going to move on to homeostasis. So homeostasis is the maintenance of a relative stable internal condition. despite the changes of the environment. So it's constant. It's in a constant state of equilibrium, and it's always readjusting as needed. Okay? This is maintained mainly by contributions from all the organ systems. So the body has to be constantly monitored and regulated to maintain homeostasis because a lot of things uh, can affect it. And there's nervous and endocrine systems. For example, the nervous and endocrine systems, as well as other systems, play a role in maintaining that homeostasis. So some of these variables, so these regulated variables, um, these are components, or you could say characteristics of extracellular fluid that are maintained within a set of ranges. Okay, so they can be factors like blood sugar, temperature, blood volume. Okay, so these are all variables. So, for example, if blood sugar gets too low or too high, you have receptors that pick up those changes and they send those signals to a control center, which then relays signals uh, to effectors. So that will make those adjustments to bring those levels back to equilibrium. So for any of these, it could be sugar, it could be body temperature or blood volume. Okay. So yeah, so it involves three components: receptors, control center, and effector. The receptor is the one that's monitoring the environment. So these are sensory receptors. So these are responding to stimuli that are causing changes in the controlled variables. The control center is a point at which the variable is maintained. So it's going to receive information from the receptor and it's going to determine the appropriate response. So for example, the effector, or I should say the effector is going to receive the output that's coming from the control center. So it's going to receive that signal and then it's going to provide the means to respond. So the response either reduces the stimulus, which in this case it's called the negative feedback, or it's going to enhance the stimulus, which is going to be called the positive feedback. So in a negative feedback, which is one of the most used mechanisms in the body, this is going to reduce or end the original stimulus. And we're going to go over an example of that. But the variable changes are going to be in the opposite direction of the initial change. So some examples of negative feedbacks would be like regulation of body temperature or regulation of blood glucose levels. Okay, so for the blood glucose levels, the receptors are going to sense the change in the blood glucose level. And then the pancreas, in this case, would be the control center, and that's going to secrete the insulin into the blood. So insulin causes body cells to take in glucose. So actually, body cells and the liver. The liver will also take in glucose. And because it's taken in by those body cells and the liver, it's going to decrease the blood sugar levels in the bloodstream. Okay, so that's an example of a negative feedback. Because the initial stimulus, the blood sugar, is going to eventually lead to the end of that stimulus. So the increase in blood sugar will lead to the decrease in blood sugar. That's why it's called a negative feedback. So here you can see this is just a general diagram of how these feedback mechanisms work. Okay, because you have a body that's at homeostasis, but then there's something that causes the body to that affects homeostasis. So it could go in either direction. So there's the stimulus that produces the change. There's going to be a receptor that detects the change, and there's going to be information that's sent along the um, afferent pathway to the control center. So that afferent pathway is going to send that signal that's going to arrive at the control center. So that's one way to remember. Um, afferent versus efferent. Efferent pathways are going to conduct that signal um, out of the control center. So you can think of exiting the control center. So E for exit, E for efferent, A for afferent because it arrives at the control center. Okay, so you have an output of information that's sent along the efferent to the effector, and then the effector is it feeds back to reduce the effect of the stimulus and return the variable to homeostatic level. Okay, so another example of a negative feedback would be um, body temperature regulation. So whether you're cold or hot, so we start here. If you're too cold, the stimulus is going to be the cold. So your body temperature is going to fall. You're going to have receptors that are going to detect the drop in body temperature, and these receptors are in the skin and the brain, and they're going to send the signal through the afferent pathway to the control center, which is going to be located in the brain, the thermal regulatory center in the brain. And from there, the signal will travel, or it's going to exit out of the control center through the efferent pathway to the effectors. So in this case, the skeletal muscles are the effectors. Okay. And this is going to cause those skeletal muscles to shiver. So shivering is going to produce heat. So that heat is going to rise the body temperature. And eventually it'll get to equilibrium. If you go the other way, if you're hot, let's say you were doing, very heavy exercise, um, those muscles are contracting, so that's also generating heat. So your body is overheating. That's also going to cause an imbalance in homeostasis. And so those receptors, those temperature sensitive cells in the skin are going to detect the imbalance. They're going to send the signal through the afferent pathway that's going to arrive at the control center, which is the thermal regulatory center in the brain. From there, the signal is going to exit the control center through the efferent pathway, and it's going to go to the effectors, which are the sweat glands. So the sweat glands are going to produce sweat, obviously, and the evaporation of the sweat is going to lower the body temperature. Okay, so that was a negative feedback. The other type of feedback is a positive feedback. So that's when the response enhances the original stimulus. Okay, so it may exhibit a cascade or amplifying effect as the feedback causes the variable to continue in that same direction of the initial change. So usually controls, um, this usually controls infrequent events that don't really require an adjustment. So for example, um, the enhancement of labral contractions by oxytocin. So oxytocin is a hormone that's produced by the hypothalamus and it's stored in the pituitary gland. So it causes the uterus to contract, and then it's a positive feedback because when the uterus contracts, it stimulates the production of more oxytocin. So as you can see, one feeds the other, and then it continues to increase, right? Another example of a positive feedback would be the platelet formation that allows for blood clotting. And this is one that I want you to know for something like a quiz. Okay, so actually this will be on the quiz. So just to let you know. So for blood clotting, so if you have a tear in a blood vessel, obviously that's something that needs to be repaired because otherwise the blood will exit the blood vessel. So you can have platelets that are going to adhere to that site and they're going to release chemicals. So if it's a small tear, those platelets will arrive and then the platelet plug is going to be fully formed and that would be the end of it. But if it's a big tear, those platelets are going to secrete those chemicals, and that's going to attract more platelets. So platelets are going to attract more platelets. If the cut is really big, you're going to have platelets secreting even more chemicals that are going to attract more platelets, and so forth, until there's enough platelets to completely plug the tear. Okay, but this is another example of a positive feedback. Okay. All right. So the disturbance in homeostasis is a big issue because it can increase the risk of things like diseases. It also contributes to changes that are associated with aging. Okay? Because when you age, the control systems become less efficient. If a negative feedback mechanism becomes overwhelmed, then that could lead to a destructive positive feedback mechanism that takes over. So you can see that in things like heart failure, because when heart cells or heart muscle cells don't get enough oxygen, then that leads to those cells to die. And if those muscle cells die, then the heart can no longer pump, blood efficiently. So if it's not pumping blood efficiently, then that's going to lead to even more. It's going to lead to a lack of oxygen. It's going to lead to more of those heart muscle cells to die. Okay. Okay. So we'll pause here, and then we'll continue with the next chapter on the next lecture.